talk about the counterculture. So, counterculture of the 1960s. So, this is kind of a fun one to do. We're going to talk a lot about um, the youth and what they were doing in the 1960s. We're going to talk about the hippies, the beatniks, get into some of the music and kind of their ideas, and then we'll look at kind of the impact that all of that has had on our culture, even to this day. So, all right, here we go. So youth culture. So our image of the '60s is usually dominated by hippies and radicals, which were really the minority of the people in the country for sure, and even a minority within the young people. But hippies didn't want to be part of a culture that was quote unquote running the world or ruining the world. I'm sorry. So they kind of dropped out of that mainstream culture and they just lived the way they thought was right. So they believed in free love, hard drugs, and rock and roll. And however, most people they were more normal. They limited their indulgences, especially like on drugs. So blue jeans, rock and roll, marijuana, all that was a little more limited. Most people were a little more even keel, but the hippies were a lot more fun and interesting, certainly to talk about in the 1960s. And so they became kind of the symbol of this counterculture that we're going to talk about today. So conditions gave rise to unique youth culture. So the baby boomers are just now coming of age. So their numbers mean clout. Okay, so clout means that they're going to have influence. Okay, so a lot of them are staying in school longer. So they extended the period of middle class. There's an extended period of middle class adolescence. So their time together to form a new culture. So students formed the Students for Democratic Society, or the SDS. I know when we talked about the civil rights movement, there's a lot of acronyms. Here's another one. But they issued what's known as the Port Huron Statement. So they called for an end to apathy and urged citizens to just stop accepting a country run by big government and corporations. So they were very much into freedom and democracy and the people having the power, not letting the corporations determine what the government is going to do. Okay, because the corporations don't have everyday people's interests in mind. They have their own interests in mind. And so they really were anti big government. So the youth culture. So James Dean was a major film star. He symbolized kind of the discontented teen of the 1950s. But he was killed in a car crash in 1955. But he kind of became a role model for the youth because he dressed and acted like them. Okay, so they started to dress like him, wear like leather jackets, wear jeans, kind of do their hair the same way. Another famous actor was Marlon Brando. He would often wear jeans and leather jackets. But adults felt threatened by jeans because they were considered a symbol of rebellion. And so many high schools banned them, which is kind of weird because everybody wears jeans today. But it's funny that, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they were considered to be very taboo. At UC Berkeley, so it's University of California, Berkeley, Mario Savio led the free speech movement, and he staged a sit-in at the administration building there, and 700 protesters were arrested. And eventually, the administration did give in to the students' demands for more free speech, and the SC validated students' rights to freedom of speech and assembly. And so this started to become a model for the college revolts and protests across the country that we're going to see throughout the 1960s. And a lot of this has to do with protesting things like you can see in that sign on the top, Vietnam, but also the civil rights movement. Okay, so that's going on at this time period too. And so there's a lot of things, there's a lot of unrest right now in the 1960s in the United States. So culture of experience. So in the 1950 beatniks were they searched for life enhancing experience and wisdom rather than success. Okay, so they did advocate drug use. They considered themselves to be intellectual. They were more focused on Eastern philosophy, so philosophy out of Asia. And their search for experience was eventually adopted by the counterculture of the 60s. So these 1950s beatniks are eventually going to lead to the 1960s counterculture. So the counterculture of the 60s, they wanted to live in self-contained communities called communes, and many of them did. But diggers took control of an area in Haight-Ashbury, which is in San Francisco. So Haight-Ashbury, it's a corner of two streets, and there was land available, and basically they decided that this was where they were going to congregate, and so this was a free place. They had concerts there, and there was drug use going on there, and there's all kinds of illegal activities and things of that nature going on. But they rejected material consumption, and they believed salvation was found in self-expression. That's what that word is. I realize the picture's covering it up. Self-expression. Okay, for that last one. So they also embrace spirituality. So not Christianity by any means. So they looked more, like I said before, to like Eastern philosophies. So astrology was pretty important. Eastern religions, new forms of Christianity, but Christianity was not necessarily a top priority for them. But the Unification Church and Hare Krishna movement were really big. And as counterculture declined, the communes started to become a place where criminal activity was very common. Drug use declined also, as many were becoming addicted or dying from it. So obviously that's not good for you. So it started to decline. So Golden Gate Park in 1967, this was the first human be-in. And this is basically the Hells Angels provided security for this, and there were concerts there, poetry being read, drugs. But Newsweek reported this as kind of a psychedelic love fest. But sex, drugs, and rock and roll were basically integral to the culture, so it was kind of became the anthem of the counterculture. Free love. So hippies used Freudian psychology to explain repression of human sexual impulses. And to stop the repression, if you stop the repression, then you'll be more healthy. So this is going to lead to the sexual revolution, where there wasn't really any increase in premarital sex, but more people did acknowledge it and accepted it. So drugs. So hippies advocated drug use for their mind-altering qualities. They felt it was beneficial to creativity. So one of the most popular drugs was LSD. So it convinced many people that reality was an illusion. One of these people was Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard psychology professor, and he crusaded to spread LSD to the masses. So he told the youth to tune in, turn on, and drop out. And so broader masses didn't really take LSD, but most of them smoked marijuana and things like that. But LSD was very common, especially if you were like in Hollywood and things like that. Famous musicians like the Beatles took it all the time and stuff like that. So rock and roll. So buying power gave baby boomers cultural authority. And so the rock and roll of the 50s started to merge with the folk music into protest songs, especially protesting the Vietnam War. So some of these bands started to really have mass appeal, and one of these was the Beatles, and they're arguably the best band to ever exist. But they openly made fun of elder generation's icons. They had long hair. You look at their hair. This is their first appearance on TV on the Ed Sullivan Show, and you look at their hair, and that was considered a long hair. And they had a disrespect for regular social conventions. So they did write songs that talked about drugs and things like that. So, for example, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that's a metaphor for LSD. And so rock and roll kind of took on this culture, and this culture kind of took on rock and roll, and they kind of merged and kind of became one there. So the impact of the counterculture. So Americans adopted some of their ideas. So fashion started to become more colorful and more comfortable. Military, worn out, and ethnic clothing became very popular. So people started wearing like camouflage and jeans, like I said before, and things like that are more comfortable. So these fashions started to become more mainstream. Pop art started to replace more traditional art. Sometimes they kind of intertwine, but you see you see some of these things. Would not be considered traditional art, but it took its subject matter from pop culture photos, ads, brand name products, things like that. And new generation of music. So I talked about the Beatles, but Bob Dylan, one of the greatest songwriters ever to exist, Janis Joplin, they use their lyrics to describe fears and hopes of the youth, and they really connected to the youth. And Jimi Hendrix was just a master at electric guitar, and he gained stardom as a result of that. All right. So your processor is going to be to complete the video questions. So go ahead and make sure you're doing that, and make sure this is turned up so you can hear it. All right, here we go.
The band The Who, in their famous song titled My Generation, said, "I hope I die before I get old." Well, in the 1960s, many young people could totally understand this desire for an early death. They saw all the damage that their parents' generation had caused. The world was constantly on the brink of nuclear war, and society wasn't moving forward. Well, no wonder they rebelled against it all and wished to be forever young. Hello, history fans. I'm Brett, and welcome to It's History. In today's episode, we travel back to the swinging 60s and look at how the so-called counterculture came about. The counterculture emerged in the early 1960s in the US and UK, and then spilled over into other Western countries. In principle, one could say it really took off with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963. So why was this event so important? Well, Kennedy campaigned for civil rights and against discrimination, which many young people wanted, of course. Sure, the counterculture was not created solely by this assassination, but it was something like the last straw. What is exactly a counterculture? Well, as the name suggests, this is a culture that is against something. But against what? Let's look at the context of the 1960s. The Cold War reached a climax with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the world on the verge of nuclear war. The newest generation came of age during this time and began to question the norms and values of their dominant culture. Now, different groups, such as African Americans, women, gays, and lesbians, began to demand their rights. And civil rights and freedom of speech became central to creating a society that was more inclusive. Revolution. And it was in the universities where many of the protests began. So in principle, the counterculture of the 1960s and early 1970s was thus a mixture of people, ideas, events, circumstances, and technological developments. This made for an exceptionally rapid change. Okay, let's have a look at a few examples of what I mean. One very important event was the Vietnam War. Now, Vietnam was divided in 1954 into a northern and a southern part. In the north, the communist Viet Cong wanted to bring South Vietnam back under its control by armed force. Vietnam was also very important for the Eastern and Western Bloc. The East wanted to win more communist satellite states, and the West feared a communist revolt in the region. So the United States supported South Vietnam with equipment and advice. Later, Kennedy would lead covert air attacks against Viet Cong villages where the dreaded napalm bomb was used. Now, there is an image that went around the world, and which you certainly know, a crying, naked girl running away from a napalm cloud of smoke rising menacingly in the sky. The girl is the then 9-year-old Kim Phuc, whose village was attacked by South Vietnamese planes. Now, from 1965, the Americans sent ground troops to South Vietnam, while China and Soviet Union supported the North with armed shipments. The Soviet Union itself sent no troops, and so we have another classic proxy war that was so typical of the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union tried to expand their spheres of influence without themselves fighting each other. Instead, they basically placed the burden of their conflict on the backs of others. Surely you're asking what this has to do with the counterculture. Well, a whole lot. By this time, millions of households in the US had a television, and images of the war made it into almost every American living room. The realities of war for those who remained at home had up till then been something one heard of at a distance, or read about, but now both were being experienced quite directly. The counterculture was therefore an anti-war culture. Many young Americans had to watch their friends become drafted to fight in Vietnam. The hippie movement grew out of this desire for peace. Hippies wanted to change society by withdrawing from it. They were critical of the establishment and the government. Some hippies turned away from the grid and formed their own self-contained communities. In West Berlin, for example, the famous Commune 1, or the K1, was the first politically motivated commune in Germany. An important influence on the hippies was the Beat generation that was active mainly in the 50s. It was a group of young writers who, like the hippies, rejected materialism and were all for sexual freedom and mind-expanding substances. The Beat movement then became absorbed into this counterculture. Now, many of the beatniks swapped their sunglasses and black turtlenecks for colorful clothes and political positions. When it comes to the swinging 60s, you might think the counterculture had taken place only in the West. This is not exactly the case. Sure, the counterculture arrived a little later in the East, but it arrived nonetheless. For many in the Soviet Union, the 60s were seen as a period of stagnation. A majority of young people no longer believed in a better, more democratic future, and the counterculture took off, especially in cities like Moscow, Riga, Kiev, and Vilnius. The counterculture in the East followed the slogan, "Make love, not war," and many young people refused military service. Obviously, the socialist regime did not find this to be so groovy, and hippies were socially ostracized and harassed. All who dressed differently and did not cooperate with the socialist standard were automatically considered anti-Soviet elements. You see, the East was rebelling and the public was becoming more critical. A highlight of this development was the so-called Prague Spring. A slow process of liberalization took place in the Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic, mainly because the country was in an economic crisis. In particular, the next generation criticized the low standards of living, and artists and intellectuals protested against censorship. Other neighboring states of the Warsaw Pact were not so happy with the reforms, and were afraid that socialism could be at risk. The situation escalated, and troops from the Warsaw Pact marched into Czechoslovakia on the night of the 20th of August 1968.
The citizens of Prague knew the full meaning of occupation by force. The Russians, while supposedly their allies, were not wanted. The fighting spirit of many Czechs was aroused. They retaliated against overwhelming power. But it showed the free world, and Russia too, that their desire to shape their own destiny was stronger even than the heaviest tank or the biggest gun.
There were protests against the occupation, and nearly 100 people were killed in demonstrations. Such an operation was later justified by the Brezhnev Doctrine in 1968, which stated that only the Soviet Union could decide which developments were acceptable in a country and which threatened socialism. How convenient. In the so-called Moscow Protocol, a lot of reforms in Czechoslovakia were reversed, such as the freedom of press and the freedom of assembly. Now, the Prague Spring quite quickly turned into a Prague Autumn, and the counterculture in the East had to wait a lot longer than the West for real social change. A high point and climax of American counterculture can be found in U.S. President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974. Now, this was a result of Nixon's dirty tricks and illegal activities that came to light and was known as the Watergate Affair. It turned out that Tricky Dicky had 5 men break into the headquarters of the Democratic Party in Washington's Watergate complex with the intention of eavesdropping on his political opponents. Nixon's resignation was a success for the counterculture movement. Nixon pushed for the war in Vietnam, but eventually brought them back home. Perhaps the reason for why the counterculture lost its momentum may be that many of its young supporters were now themselves grown up and less rebellious. Society fell under the belief that it had become liberalized and there were fewer people and ideologies one had to fight. And there was a decisive point during the Vietnam War that deeply affected public opinion. This was the Tet Offensive. How this operation played itself out and what effect it had on the US's involvement in Vietnam, you can check out for yourself right up here. In the next episode of It's History, we will have a look at how the Cold War found its way into music, art, and culture. I'm only going to say Lord of the Rings, Watchmen, X-Men, and Bob Dylan. In the meantime, let me drop a few questions on you. How important is the counterculture of the 1960s today? And are we still in need for such a movement now in 2015? Write us your thoughts on the matter in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe for your regular dose of history. And click here in the corner for an Instagram look behind the scenes. All right, see ya.
All right, and that's all I got for you guys today. Don't forget to have a good day. See you guys later.